She fed a starving beggar on the street, and her stepmother slapped her for it. But that single act of kindness was about to unravel everything her stepmother had spent years carefully hiding. The beggar said nothing. He simply watched, with eyes far too calm, far too calculating for a man who supposedly had nothing. But he was not what he appeared to be. Beneath the torn clothes, the dirt, and the hollow silence was a man on a mission, a family lawyer in disguise, sent to find exactly the kind of person worthy of what was coming. Because somewhere buried in the legal vaults of a $700 billion empire, her late father had built from the ground up was a name, her name, written as the sole heir to everything. But her stepmother had controlled that empire for years, and she had no intention of ever letting that document see the light of day. She had silenced whispers, buried records, and ruled that household like a queen on a stolen throne. But one starving beggar on the side of the road, and one girl too kind to walk past him, had just set into motion the one thing she could never stop. So what exactly did the lawyer see in her that day? What was the real reason he was disguised? And how long had her stepmother known the truth she was never supposed to find out? The morning Celeste Hargrove nearly missed the beggar was the same morning her stepmother had handed her a list of errands long enough to fill an entire Tuesday. It was always like that. Always a list. Always a Tuesday. Vivienne Hargrove, tall, precise, and cold, in the way that only truly dangerous women manage to be, had a gift for making cruelty feel like structure. She had been running the Hargrove household since Celeste was 11 years old, the year Thomas Hargrove married her at a private ceremony in the Maldives that Celeste was not invited to attend. She had been told, through a brief phone call from her father's assistant, not from Thomas himself, that she now had a stepmother. She had pressed the phone to her ear so hard it left a mark on her cheek. She remembered that detail even now, 9 years later, standing on the cold pavement of Westfield Avenue with a canvas grocery bag cutting into her palm. She was 20 years old, and she still got handed lists. The beggar was sitting against the stone wall of a shuttered bakery, wedged between a broken shopping cart and a garbage bin that nobody had emptied in days. He was old, or he appeared old, with a gray beard matted against his jaw, and a coat that had once been charcoal wool and was now simply the color of exhaustion. A paper cup sat in front of him, empty. Celeste almost walked past him. She had been taught to walk past things, but she stopped. She didn't know why. Or, rather, she did know why, and that reason lived in a memory she rarely let herself touch. It was the memory of her father, Thomas Hargrove, before the money hardened him and before Vivienne polished him into someone Celeste no longer recognized. He used to stop for people, on the way to dinner reservations, on the way to board meetings, on the way to everywhere important. Thomas Hargrove used to stop. He'd press cash into a stranger's hand and say nothing. No sermon, no performance. Just a quiet, private transaction of human decency. He had been dead for 14 months. Celeste reached into the grocery bag and pulled out a foil-wrapped sandwich she had bought for herself. Turkey on sourdough, the only indulgence Vivienne's weekly allowance still permitted, and she crouched down in front of the man and held it out. He looked at her, and this was the moment that would later feel like the split in a fault line. Not dramatic on the surface, not loud, just a quiet shift deep below the ground where no one was watching. Because the man's eyes, when they met hers, were not the eyes of a man who had lost everything. They were focused, steady, studying her with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. But she didn't know that yet. She just saw a hungry man. So she gave him the sandwich. He took it with both hands, nodded once, said in a voice much too composed for the street. "You have your father's eyes, Miss Hargrove." Celeste froze. She opened her mouth, but the black car pulled up before a single word could leave her lips. The door swung open, and Vivienne Hargrove stepped out in heels that clicked against the pavement like a countdown. She took in the scene in under 3 seconds. Celeste crouched on the ground, the beggar, the empty cup, the missing sandwich, and something moved across her face that wasn't disgust. It was faster than disgust, sharper. It was the brief, flinching expression of someone who has just seen something they were not supposed to see and needs to shut it down immediately. She crossed the distance in 4 steps. The slap came without a word. It cracked across Celeste's cheek so hard that she stumbled sideways, catching herself against the stone wall, her canvas bag spilling across the pavement, canned goods rolling toward the gutter. The sound of it bounced off the shuttered storefronts. A woman across the street stopped walking. A teenager with earphones pulled one out. A delivery driver slowed his bicycle. But Vivienne was already leaning down, her voice a whispered blade pressed flat against Celeste's ear. "Pick up every single item. Get in the car. And don't you ever embarrass this family on a public street again." She straightened up, smoothed her blazer, and walked back to the car, as if the moment had already been filed away and forgotten. But behind her, still seated against the wall, the beggar watched everything with those same calm, calculating eyes, the sandwich untouched in his hands, and the faintest trace of a decision settled across his face. It had taken him 6 weeks of searching, 3 cities, 11 locations, but he had finally found her. The ride back to the Hargrove estate was 16 minutes long. Celeste counted every one of them. She sat in the back seat with her canvas bag pressed against her knees, and her cheek still burning, not just from the slap, but from the humiliation of it. The public witnessed undeniable humiliation of being struck like a child on a street corner by a woman who had never once, in 9 years of living under the same roof, called her by her first name without making it sound like an inconvenience. Vivienne sat beside the driver in the front seat, scrolling through her phone with the serene composure of a woman who had simply corrected a minor household matter and moved on. She did not look back once. She never did. Looking back, Celeste had come to understand, implied that something behind you still mattered. Vivienne Hargrove did not believe in things that still mattered, but the beggar's words were still running laps inside Celeste's skull, and no amount of focused breathing was slowing them down. "You have your father's eyes, Miss Hargrove." He had known her name. He had known her father. And he had said it, not with the stumbling familiarity of someone who had simply seen her photograph in a tabloid headline, but with the quiet, weighted certainty of someone who had been close enough to Thomas Hargrove to know exactly what his eyes looked like, close enough to compare them, close enough to carry that detail across years and still hold it with precision. The car turned through the iron gates of the estate, and Celeste pressed her fingernail into the inside of her wrist, a private signal she had developed at 13 to keep herself from crying in front of Vivienne. It worked the same way it always had. Pain redirected. Tears retreated. She had learned to be very good at not crying in front of the woman who had given her so many reasons to. 3 miles away, in a coffee shop on the corner of Westfield and Grant, a man peeled off a gray beard and set it carefully on the table beside a lukewarm cup of black coffee. His name was Raymond Alcott. He was 61 years old, a senior partner at Alcott and Brennan Legal Associates, and for the past 32 years, he had been the sole legal counsel of Thomas Hargrove, the man who had built a $700 billion empire from a single failing textile company his own father had left him in debt. Raymond had watched Thomas build it, had structured every acquisition, every merger, every ironclad clause that protected what Thomas spent his life constructing. And he had been there, sitting in that same leather chair across from Thomas's hospital bed, on the night Thomas Hargrove whispered the last real instruction he would ever give. Find her, Raymond. Make sure she's still her. Make sure Vivienne hasn't finished the job. Raymond had not fully understood what Thomas meant by finish the job until he began pulling documents that should have been accessible and found, instead, a pattern of deletions, omissions, redirections. A paper trail so meticulously altered that a less experienced eye would have accepted it as simply the natural complexity of a large estate. But Raymond Alcott had drafted those documents himself. He knew exactly what they were supposed to say, and what they said now was not what Thomas Hargrove had intended. He pulled a small leather notebook from inside his coat and opened it to a page he had already read 40 times. At the top, in his own handwriting, were 3 lines he had written the morning after Thomas's funeral. The morning Vivienne had walked into the estate's main office, changed every lock, and handed Raymond a termination letter signed with a notary stamp dated 2 days before Thomas died. 2 days before. While Thomas was still unconscious in a medically induced coma. But Raymond had kept a copy of everything, because 32 years of practicing law had taught him one fundamental truth. The people most eager to rewrite a document are always the people most afraid of what it originally said. The original will of Thomas Hargrove, the real one, the one Vivienne did not know Raymond had preserved in a sealed vault under a separate legal entity, left 100% of the Hargrove Group's controlling shares to Celeste Marie Hargrove, not Vivienne, not Vivienne's biological son, Preston, the 24-year-old who now sat in Thomas's old chair in the Hargrove Group's downtown headquarters and signed documents he barely understood with a signature he had practiced in the mirror. Celeste. Entirely. Irrevocably. But what Raymond had not anticipated, what had kept him awake for 14 months and driven him to disguise himself and search 3 cities across 11 locations, was the discovery he had made just 4 weeks ago. Buried inside a secondary file Vivienne's legal team had accidentally left unsealed during a routine court submission. It was a medical record. Private. Dated 6 weeks before Thomas Hargrove's first stroke, and attached to it was a prescription record. And a name. The name of the private nurse Vivienne had hired. Raymond closed the notebook, because what that medical record suggested was not that Thomas Hargrove had simply fallen ill. It suggested that someone had helped him get there. He looked down at the untouched sandwich still wrapped in foil on the table in front of him. The sandwich a young woman had crouched down on a cold pavement to hand him, without hesitation, without performance, without even pausing to check whether anyone was watching. He thought about her eyes. Thomas had been right. They were exactly the same. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone, dialed a number he had not called in over a year. It rang twice. "Is it her?" said the voice on the other end. Raymond looked out the coffee shop window toward the direction of the Hargrove estate, that massive, beautiful, stolen kingdom sitting behind its iron gates, and he exhaled slowly. "It's her," he said, "and we need to move fast, because I don't think Vivienne knows yet that I'm still alive. But she's going to figure it out. And when she does," he paused, "that girl is going to be in far more danger than she already is." But what Raymond did not know, what neither he nor Celeste, nor anyone outside the estate's private walls could have known, was that Vivienne Hargrove had already received a phone call of her own 20 minutes ago, while Celeste was still counting minutes in the back seat, and the single sentence the caller had delivered had caused Vivienne to set her phone face down on her knee, stare at the road ahead, and say nothing for the remaining 11 minutes of the drive. The sentence was this: "Raymond Alcott was seen on Westfield Avenue today. He was with your stepdaughter." Vivienne had not reacted. She had not flinched. She had not even blinked, but her thumb had pressed so hard into the edge of her phone that when she finally set it down, there was a pale crescent mark pressed into her skin. And for the first time in 14 months, Vivienne Hargrove was afraid. Vivienne Hargrove was afraid for exactly 47 minutes. Then she stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. There was a difference, a critical, irreversible difference, between a woman who feared losing something and a woman who had already decided she would burn every surrounding structure to the ground before she allowed that something to be taken. Vivienne had crossed that line before. She had crossed it quietly, methodically, and with the kind of patience that most people mistook for grace. She had crossed it the night she slipped a private nurse named Dana Holloway $300,000 in untraceable wire transfers and a first-class ticket to Portugal, 2 days before Thomas Hargrove's condition suddenly and irreversibly declined. She had crossed it the morning she walked into Raymond Alcott's office with a termination letter stamped by a notary who owed her a favor, and watched the old man's face absorb the blow with the dignified stillness of someone who had not yet understood the full scope of what was being done to him. She had crossed it 14 months ago when she stood at Thomas Hargrove's graveside in a black veil, holding a single white rose, performing grief so convincingly that 3 separate board members had approached her afterward to express their personal condolences and their continued confidence in her leadership of the Hargrove Group. She had always been very good at performance. But Raymond Alcott being alive, Raymond Alcott being on Westfield Avenue, Raymond Alcott being within 20 feet of Celeste was not a performance she had scripted. And unscripted moments, in Vivienne's experience, were the only moments that ever truly destroyed people. She needed to move. Tonight. Celeste did not go to dinner that evening. She told the housekeeper, Mrs. Alma Greer, a soft-spoken woman in her late 50s, who had worked in the Hargrove estate since before Celeste was born, that she had a headache, and Alma had looked at the fading red mark still visible along Celeste's cheekbone and said nothing, but pressed a cold cloth into her hand with both of hers and held on for just a second longer than necessary. That single extra second nearly broke Celeste completely. She sat on the edge of her bed in the east wing, the wing farthest from Vivienne's master suite, the wing Thomas had quietly ensured was Celeste's when the estate was restructured after his first hospitalization, and she pressed the cold cloth against her cheek and stared at the wall. "You have your father's eyes, Miss Hargrove." She had Googled it. She was almost ashamed of how quickly she had done it. The moment she was alone, the phone already in her hand before the bedroom door had fully closed. She had searched Thomas Hargrove Estate, legal counsel, attorney. The third result was an archived business profile from 11 years ago, a law firm, Alcott and Brennan Legal Associates. And beside the name of the senior partner was a photograph. Celeste had stared at that photograph for a long time. The man in it was younger, clean-shaven, sharp-suited, every inch the composed legal architect of a billionaire's empire. But the eyes were the same, the set of the jaw, the particular quality of stillness in the expression. It was him. The beggar on Westfield Avenue was Raymond Alcott, her father's lawyer. But why had he been disguised? Why had he been on that street, on that specific morning, in that specific location? And how had he known her name with such certainty? Not as a guess, not as a vague recognition, but as the solid, unhesitating identification of a man who had been looking for her specifically. She was still turning these questions like stones in her hands when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She had been raised in a household where unknown numbers meant press inquiries or unwanted complications, and Vivienne had long ago trained her to let those calls go to voicemail. But something, the same instinct that had made her stop on the pavement that morning, the same quiet inheritance of her father's particular brand of human attention, made her press accept. "Miss Hargrove." The voice was measured, deliberate, familiar in a way she couldn't yet place. "My name is Raymond Alcott. I was your father's attorney for 32 years. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not repeat a single word of this conversation to anyone inside that house. Not the housekeeper, not the staff, and especially not your stepmother." Celeste's hand tightened around the phone. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "Your father gave it to me," Raymond said. 4 years ago. He made me memorize it. He told me the day would come when I'd need it, and that when it did, time would be the one thing we wouldn't have." The cold cloth slipped from Celeste's fingers onto the floor. "He told me something else too," Raymond continued. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him before he could reach you himself, I was to tell you this. The will Vivienne presented to the board is not the will your father wrote. The company, all of it, every share, every asset, every subsidiary under the Hargrove Group umbrella, belongs to you, has always belonged to you. And there is a sealed document in a private vault that proves it beyond any legal challenge Vivienne's attorneys can mount." Celeste stood up from the bed without realizing she had done it. Her legs were shaking. She pressed her back against the wall, the same wall she had stared at 10 minutes ago, and forced air into her lungs. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed. "Why not 14 months ago? Why not at the funeral? Why not?" "Because 14 months ago I didn't know what I know now," Raymond said. And then he paused, the kind of pause that carries weight, that holds something inside it that the speaker is bracing themselves to release. "Miss Hargrove, your father did not simply fall ill. I have documentation, medical records, financial transfers, the identity of a private nurse who left the country 48 hours before his final decline. That strongly suggests your father's death was not entirely natural." The silence that followed was so complete that Celeste could hear her own pulse. "Are you telling me," she said, and her voice came out quieter and steadier than she expected. Quieter than grief, quieter than shock. The voice of someone standing at the absolute bottom of something and discovering, to their own surprise, that the ground is solid. "That Vivienne killed my father." Raymond was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I am telling you," he said carefully, "that the evidence I have collected points in a direction that no court of law, once presented with it, will be able to ignore." But what Raymond said next, the final detail he had been holding back, the piece of information he had wrestled with for weeks, was the thing that shattered every remaining wall Celeste had been holding up since she was 11 years old and pressing a phone too hard against her cheek. "There's something else. Something I discovered only recently that changes everything about who you can and cannot trust inside that house." He paused again. "Alma Greer, your housekeeper, the woman who has worked in that estate for 26 years, the woman your father trusted completely." Celeste's stomach dropped. "She has been reporting your movements, your conversations, and your private behaviors directly to Vivienne for the past 3 years. Every late-night phone call, every letter, every moment of vulnerability you allowed yourself inside those walls." Raymond's voice was not unkind, but it was unsparing. "She is not who you believe her to be, Miss Hargrove, and the cold cloth she just pressed into your hand, she will describe this exact moment to Vivienne before midnight." Celeste looked down at the cold cloth on the floor. She thought about that extra second, that one lingering, tender, deliberately human extra second. And she understood, in the hollowing, nauseating way that only real betrayal delivers. That kindness in this house had always been a surveillance tool. But somewhere beneath the devastation, beneath the grief and the humiliation and the shaking in her legs, something else was rising. Something that felt, for the first time in 20 years of living as a ghost in her own inheritance, remarkably like fury. Fury, Celeste discovered that night, was not loud. It did not arrive with screaming or slamming doors, or the kind of dramatic unraveling that Vivienne had always seemed to anticipate and secretly prepare for from the stepdaughter she had spent 9 years methodically diminishing. Vivienne had built an entire architecture of control around the assumption that when Celeste finally broke, she would break loudly, visibly, in a way that could be documented, pathologized, and used. But Celeste did not break loudly. She sat on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the wall and the cold cloth at her feet, and Raymond Alcott still on the line. And she made a decision with the quiet, irreversible certainty of a woman who had just realized that every single thing she had ever lost had been deliberately taken. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. Raymond exhaled, the long, slow exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for 14 months. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Vivienne is holding the Hargrove Group's annual shareholders meeting at the downtown headquarters. Every board member, every major investor, every senior executive will be in that building. Press will be outside. The whole infrastructure of that company, the company your father built, will be gathered in one room." He paused. "I need you to be in that room, Celeste." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the way you notice a door opening in a wall you believed was solid. "I've already filed an emergency legal motion with the court this afternoon," Raymond continued. "A judge, one who cannot be reached by Vivienne's attorneys, because I made very certain of that, has granted a temporary injunction freezing all asset transfers and board decisions, pending a formal review of the estate's original documentation. That injunction will be served to Vivienne's legal team at 9:15 tomorrow morning." "The meeting starts at 9, Celeste said. "Yes," Raymond said simply. "It does." And for the first time in 9 years, Celeste felt something that had no name, but felt very much like her father, standing just behind her left shoulder, steady and quiet and entirely certain. She picked the cold cloth up off the floor, folded it, set it on the nightstand, with a deliberate, final neatness. "I'll be there," she said. But the night was not finished delivering its revelations. At 11:43 p.m., 17 minutes before Raymond had predicted Alma Greer would make her report, Celeste's bedroom door opened without a knock. It was not Alma. It was Preston Hargrove. Vivienne's son stood in the doorway in a pressed shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he looked, for the first time in the 4 years Celeste had known him, as the polished, boardroom-groomed, effortlessly arrogant heir to a throne he hadn't built. Genuinely undone. His hair was wrong, his eyes were red at the edges, and in his right hand was a manila envelope that he was gripping so hard the corners had bent. Celeste stared at him. Preston Hargrove had never, in 4 years, entered her wing of the house. He had barely spoken to her at meals. He had referred to her, in a conversation she was not meant to overhear, but had, at a dinner party 18 months ago, as my mother's charity project. She had swallowed that, the same way she had swallowed everything else. But the man standing in her doorway right now was not performing arrogance. He was performing courage, the effortful, reluctant courage of someone who has made a decision that terrifies them. "I need to show you something," Preston said. His voice was stripped of everything she had ever associated with it. "And I need you to know, before you look at it, that I didn't know. I swear to you, Celeste, I didn't know what she did to your father. I didn't know any of it until 3 weeks ago. Celeste didn't move, didn't speak. Let him stand in the weight of the doorway and carry his own words. She told me the company was rightfully hers, he continued, and his jaw tightened with the specific shame of a man confronting his own willing blindness. She told me your father had wanted it that way, that you didn't want the responsibility, that the will was clean and legal, and he stopped, pressed his lips together. I wanted to believe her, because believing her was easier than believing what she actually is. He crossed the room and held out the envelope. Inside were 12 pages, bank transfer records, a communication thread between Vivienne and a private physician, not Dana Holloway, but someone above her, someone who had orchestrated the entire medical protocol. And at the bottom of the stack, a single handwritten note on Hargrove Group letterhead, in a handwriting Celeste had not seen in 14 months, but would have recognized in absolute darkness, her father's handwriting. Celeste, you are reading this. Then Raymond found you, and the truth is finally moving. I'm sorry it took this long to reach you. I'm sorry for every Tuesday. I love you more than the thing I built. Make it yours. Dad, the note was dated 8 days before Thomas Hargrove's first stroke. He had known. He had known what Vivienne was planning and had not been able to stop it. But he had made sure, in every way available to a man who felt the walls closing in, that the truth would outlive the woman trying to bury it. Celeste read the note 3 times. Then she folded it against her chest, pressed it there with both hands, and cried, for the first time since her father's funeral, with the full, unguarded weight of everything she had been holding since she was 11 years old, and pressing a phone too hard against her cheek. Preston sat on the floor against the wall and said nothing. He did not try to comfort her. He simply stayed, which was, in that moment, the only right thing to do. The Hargrove Group's annual shareholders meeting began at 9 a.m. in the 43rd floor conference room of the downtown headquarters tower. Celeste walked in at 9:08. She had worn her father's favorite color, a deep, deliberate navy, and she had done her hair the way she had done it for his last birthday. The last birthday they had celebrated together before Vivienne had restructured the family calendar and made private celebrations feel like inconveniences. She carried nothing but a slim leather folder and the folded note pressed inside it. Raymond Alcott was already in the room. He was not in disguise. He was in a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit when they are earned rather than purchased, and he was standing at the far end of the conference table with the particular stillness of a man who has prepared for something for a very long time and is finally watching it begin. Vivienne saw him first. The color left her face with a speed that was almost architectural, like watching a building lose its foundation floor by floor from the bottom up. She was seated at the head of the table, Thomas's chair, the chair she had slid into 14 months ago with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been measuring the distance to it for years. And she gripped the armrests and went absolutely, catastrophically still. Every board member in the room noticed. The room had been mid-conversation, the low, overlapping murmur of powerful people performing casual confidence, and it died in sections, like lights going out across a city block. This meeting, Raymond said, without raising his voice, is subject to an emergency legal injunction filed with the Superior Court of New York at 4:17 yesterday afternoon, and granted by Judge Harold Stein at 7:52 p.m. He reached into his briefcase and removed a bound document stack. Copies have been provided to each member of this board as of 7 a.m. this morning. Every transaction, transfer, and board resolution passed under the current administration is hereby frozen, pending a full judicial review of the estate of Thomas Hargrove. The room erupted. But Vivienne was not looking at Raymond. She was looking at Celeste, who had walked to the far end of the table and was standing quietly and completely in the space directly opposite her stepmother. And in Vivienne's eyes was something Celeste had waited 20 years to see. Not rage, not calculation, not the cold, managing composure that had governed every interaction between them since Celeste was 11 years old. Fear. Pure, unmanaged, unperformable fear. "You have no legal standing," Vivienne said, and her voice was still even, still smooth, because Vivienne Hargrove would perform composure until the walls were physically touching her. "You are not a board member. You have no documented claim." "She has every documented claim," Raymond said, and he set a second-bound document in front of the nearest board member, who picked it up with visibly unsteady hands. The original last will and testament of Thomas Hargrove, notarized, witnessed, and preserved under seal in a private legal vault established specifically to protect it from unauthorized alteration. 100% of controlling shares in the Hargrove Group to Celeste Marie Hargrove, irrevocably. The board member holding the document looked up, then looked at Celeste, then looked at Vivienne, and Vivienne looked at Preston. It was a reflex, the instinctive pivot of a woman who had always kept her son as her last secured position. The look that said, "You are mine. You will stand with me. You will not move." Preston met his mother's eyes, and then he reached into his jacket, removed the manila envelope, and slid it across the table to Raymond Alcott, without a word. The sound that left Vivienne in that moment wasn't a word. It was not even fully a sound. It was the compressed, involuntary exhale of a woman watching the last wall come down, and realizing, in the same instant, that she had built every single one of those walls herself, and handed the demolition tools to the people she had most underestimated. Raymond opened the envelope, reviewed the first page, looked up at the board. "I am also presenting today," he said, "financial and medical documentation pertaining to the circumstances of Thomas Hargrove's death. Documentation that has been simultaneously forwarded this morning to the New York District Attorney's Office, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and 3 separate investigative journalists whose editors have already confirmed publication pending today's proceedings." The room was no longer erupting. The room was silent in the way that rooms go silent when something irreversible has just happened, and everyone present understands it simultaneously. Vivienne stood up. She was still performing. Even now, even with the injunction documents in 12 pairs of hands, even with her own son's evidence on the table, even with Raymond Alcott standing alive and composed in a room she had spent 14 months believing he would never enter again. She was still performing. She smoothed her blazer. She lifted her chin. She arranged her expression into something that was almost dignity. "I will not be addressed in this manner," she said. "I will not sit in this room while—" "You will sit," said Celeste. It was the first word Celeste had spoken since walking into the room, and the quality of it, the quiet, absolute, unperforming certainty of it, stopped Vivienne mid-sentence as effectively as a physical barrier. Every head in the room turned to Celeste. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had her father's voice when she chose to use it, low and direct and built for rooms exactly like this one. "You slapped me on a public street yesterday," Celeste said, "for feeding a hungry man. You have been striking me, diminishing me, and erasing me from my own inheritance since I was 11 years old. You had my father's medical care manipulated by people you paid to ensure he would not recover. You forged his estate documents. You installed yourself in his chair and his company and his life. And you made me feel, for the better part of 2 decades, that I was lucky to be permitted to exist inside what was already mine." She paused. Let every word settle into every corner of the room. "So no," she said. You will not be leaving. You will sit in that chair, the chair you stole from my father. For the last few minutes, it will ever belong to you. And you will watch everything you built on his grave be taken back." Vivienne sat down. She didn't choose to. Her legs simply stopped holding her. The legal proceedings that followed took 4 months. But the outcome had been decided in that room on that morning, in the 43 seconds of silence after Celeste finished speaking, and not a single board member moved to support the woman at the head of the table. Vivienne Hargrove was indicted on charges of fraud, forgery, financial manipulation, and, after Dana Holloway was located in Lisbon, and agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence, conspiracy in the negligent homicide of Thomas Hargrove. Preston cooperated fully with investigators and received immunity. He resigned from the board the same afternoon and left the estate with 2 suitcases and no forwarding address. Alma Greer was dismissed and quietly, devastatingly confirmed everything Raymond had suspected. She had been in Vivienne's employment as an informant since the first year of the marriage, recruited with the specific purpose of monitoring Celeste. The Hargrove Group was restructured under Celeste's full legal authority within 60 days. Raymond Alcott was reinstated as senior legal counsel on the first morning of the new administration. He arrived at the office to find a note on his desk, handwritten on Hargrove Group letterhead, in a handwriting that looked, with the particular genetic faithfulness of children who have inherited the right things, remarkably like Thomas Hargrove's own. It said, "Thank you for stopping on Westfield Avenue. C." But the moment that stayed with Celeste, the moment she would return to years later, when the company had grown, and the court case had concluded, and the estate had been reclaimed, and the world had restructured itself around the truth, was not the boardroom. It wasn't the verdict. It was not the morning the first document arrived, transferring full controlling shares into her name. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the shareholders' meeting, on a cold morning that felt like every Tuesday before it. Canvas bag, pavement, the particular weight of an ordinary day. Celeste walked down Westfield Avenue alone. The shuttered bakery had reopened. The stone wall was clean. She stopped in front of it, and she stood there for a moment. Just a moment. Not as the heir to $700 billion. Not as the woman who had walked into a boardroom and quietly dismantled a stolen empire. Not as the daughter who had finally delivered her father's real will into the light. Just as herself. Just Celeste. Then she reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a sandwich, set it on the wall, and walked forward into whatever came next.